Today, Jim and I are going to talk about a really exciting topic, which is building a team for product-led growth. This is a really tricky subject. A lot of companies are facing this right now. Jim's got some unique hands-on experience here, so we're super excited to dive in. Jim, welcome. Thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Blake. I really appreciate it. I have a lot of passion on this topic. I'm still learning, hopefully along with everybody else. So I'll try to share my experiences, but I think everybody should know that this is an evolving thing. Yeah. It's very organic when it gets executed in organizations. So
yeah, it's super exciting. And PLG is such a new, it's still such a relatively new concept and, idea in the business world. So it's not like something people are, I don't think like doing case studies on in business school or something yet. Like if you want to learn it, you kind of got to be a practitioner or talk to practitioners, which is why we're super excited to have you here today. But yeah, let's dive in. I mean, building a PLG team, like kind of where do you start? What are the kind of like high level thoughts you have kind of going into figuring this out?
Yeah, for sure. And one quick thing I'd say is like my background before the companies you talked about was also in consumer. And we think of PLG as like a new thing in the B2B SaaS kind of world, but actually, if you've been in a consumer company, you've been doing PLG for a long time. We call it game mechanics. We call it lots of different things, building viral loops. But like some of these ideas have been around actually for quite a while. If you've been on the consumer side of things. So when I was at Yahoo running like Yahoo Answers and Flickr, for example, we had lots of focus around things that are now skills that I've taken forward into more B2B companies as well. So if you're ever looking to build out your team around PLG, one piece of advice I have for you is to think about folks who've had some consumer experience because they likely have kind of been in this mindset before. But basically, and I say that because basically I think the first thing you want to do is really start out for like, what are your expectations for PLG? What's the state of your business and product, right? I've talked to startups through SignalFire on our investing side who are like, yeah, we're building a PLG motion. I'm like, yeah, but your tool requires you to install an agent on a piece of infrastructure. It requires root access. It requires SSH keys. There's all these things about it that make it, kind of difficult potentially to set up. Do you really think product-led growth is going to be the way to go for you? So I think it's really important to look at your own company, your own sales motion, and the state of your product and say, hey, for me, a tenet of PLG is that somebody independently can load up your product experience. They can dive into it. They can get value right away, and they can do it without anybody else helping them, basically. So I think that's the first kind of hard question to ask yourself is, are we ready? And does our sales motion make sense, right? We'll talk about enterprise a bit later, but some enterprises and some product connections with enterprises aren't a great fit for PLG because of requiring security access or a bunch of people in a buying committee to get involved to even deploy your service, your product initially. So I think, again, starting with like, hey, do I have a product that can be adopted by individuals? Can they get into it and get value out of it right away? Does it not require a ton of configuration to be valuable to them is really important. And then again, from a goals perspective, you may want to drive your whole business on PLG. You may want to say, hey, I want them to come in. I want them to self-serve, pay me money, put in a credit card. Everything's great. You may want to use it, though, to feed your sales team. Like that might be another objective here. Maybe the product's more complicated from a pricing configuration perspective, or the ACV is super high. You may want to use PLG just to expose yourself to the organization bottoms up, and then have your sales team get involved as well when it comes time to actually move beyond the users to the buyers, basically. Or you may want to use PLG to drive expansion of a product you've already sold in through some other mechanism and use product-led growth to help people explore and delve into deeper parts of your product or adjacent products you're trying to sell them. So I think starting with your goals and really looking at yourself carefully in the mirror with your product and say, hey, are we really ready for this? Is this something that people can self-serve or not? Is really important because I've seen a number of failed attempts where we just didn't have that in place. And as just a quick example, I joined New Relic, which really made its name making performance monitoring much more accessible and easily achieved through self-serve. A couple of the other products weren't. So there are actually products at New Relic that weren't using PLG when I arrived, and we had to change that. And of course, it made a huge difference in the business. So I say that this is an ongoing thing because I've seen a lot of companies that have done like an initial PLG motion, done it really, really well. But then they add on additional products and services and aren't as thoughtful about those follow-on products and services, and it kind of falls down on the ground again. So for me, it's an ongoing investment in any company, basically.
Yeah, tons of great advice there, and I'll really just to underscore two parts of that. Knowing the ICP and kind of nailing the fit with who the ICP or who that entry point person is so critical. I've seen a ton of companies get this wrong or sort of miss this critical ingredient here. Kind of anecdotally, I was at Atlassian for 5 years, which famously sort of pioneered a lot of the PLG and self-serve motion with Jira. And, such an under or overlooked factor is just like, they were selling software to software engineers. Like that is, by nature, an audience that's just going to have a higher tolerance for getting hands-on, figuring something out regarding software. Like you switch the ICP or audience, like you could have everything else exactly the same. Like you're not going to have that fit. So thinking through like that, that fit with the ICP and audience is super important. And I also love what you said about the sort of consumer side acquisition and marketing. And it's a great point that, consumer B2C side has been doing this kind of thing for a super long time, both at the sort of the highest level, sort of like brand building function and sort of doing that super well. And also the tactical kind of like converting market to customer in a sort of super efficient self-serve manner. Ton of great lessons in consumer side. And yeah, if you're in B2B marketing or growth, little cheat code for you if you haven't figured it out already. Look to consumer for all sorts of things, because it's just the B2C side is a great source of inspiration across the board, it seems like.
Yeah, totally. my big wake up call there was spending time with folks from Zynga and looking at when they were pushing game releases every twice a week, looking at every metric to see how it was moving. Like it was really clear how laser focused they were on like their user engagement and how to drive more engagement. And there are literally game mechanics that are designed to make us come back every day to use the product that I learned about. And actually, once you learn those mechanics, it spoils games for you forever, because it's like, oh yeah, you're trying to use that mechanic on me.
You can sort of see the seams there. Yeah.
I'll do a quick shout out to that. Amy Jo Kim, for those who don't know her, is somebody who's brought a lot of thinking around game mechanic applied to software. She's got a book. I don't remember the title of it offhand, but I'm sure we can follow up on that.
Cool. Yeah.
But I've worked with her and I haven't worked with her directly, but a couple of the game designers on product development, specifically with these ideas in mind. I mean, I really think it's a good angle to think about for sure.
Yeah, that's an awesome. But yeah, those are great businesses, because the unit economics of the business is a forcing function for like efficiency. Like it will never support a high touch sales motion. So like they have no choice but to sort of operate at scale with GTM. It's super interesting. So let's dive into maybe some of the tactics around building out the PLG team. What do you think about in terms of, I would say, functions and kind of like sequencing of those functions?
Yeah. So, I mean, the first thing, hopefully this is already happening within the team, but the first thing is actually to make sure you've actually fully instrumented your experience, right? A common failure mode is people are like, yes, let's go do PLG. And you say, great, have you instrumented your product and your website and your funnel? And they're like, well, we've got Google Analytics on our website, and but not so much on the product side. It's on engineering's list. It's a P3, feature to implement, and we'll get to it next quarter, right? And the reality is it's really, really hard to do PLG if you can't see, if you're flying in the dark. So for me, a prerequisite of this is having really good instrumentation in your product experience. So where are people looking? Where are they clicking? What pages are they on? How long do they stay there? Do they use that feature heavily? So you can actually, understand behaviors and understand what creates stickiness and what I call activation within the product. And ultimately, I always look to the product leader, the product manager on this, to really have a deep knowledge of like what they believe the key activation points are within a product. When you first sign up for something, what's the first thing you do? Do you get the value from that? What's the next thing you do? And again, this is a practice that as a product leader, you should always step back and say, okay, like, let me think about that journey of that customer through the experience of my product, as they get deeper and deeper into it. And how do I kind of pull them along through the way I design the user experience, potentially the way I do notifications within the product, just ways to like guide people to places that I know are going to create stickiness. So that the product manager, the product leader, again, if you're a small company, this might be one person wearing lots of hats, but the work here is to think about that product experience and what those key activation points are that you can see from data, if you instrument it, drive additional engagement, drive them to go deeper into the product. And if you don't have a handle on your activation points, it's time to step back, instrument, and see what's happening. See where so-called where the cows are blazing paths through the product. It's not always consistent from user to user either, right? There's different paths of activation through products typically as well. Definitely with consumer products and certainly with business products as well. So you're going to get this sense over time as a product owner of like, there's all these different journeys through my product, and some of these are more fruitful than others. And how do I like build the product experience to like pull some of those capabilities forward in the user experience potentially, so they get exposed to that stuff more fully. For example, creating a custom query in a dashboard might be something that creates an incredible stickiness. So maybe there's a tooltip early on in the experience that says, hey, try out a custom query, and here's a sample to work with. and they get this like aha moment. So yeah, Will, who's on the chat, is reminding me of one of my famous sayings, which is I always say, if you can't measure it, don't ship it.
Nice.
So that's always been on my whiteboards in my offices. And actually, when I joined SignalFire, I actually called that out in my blog post about why I was joining the venture firm, because SignalFire uniquely has a data practice and a product team around data that we use to support a variety of our activities. I'll go into that later. But like that like just hit me right in the gut. It's like, this is my kind of company, right? My kind of VC. So anyway, so product manager is a key player here for sure. Thinking through product experience and activation points. The other player here, I mean, there's a number of players. The other player is important, is your product marketer or your marketer, depending on what titles you use. And this is the person who's worrying about how they message and talk about the product, messaging and positioning. They're thinking about how we package and price the product as well, working with a product leader, because often your pricing model, your value model, dovetails very nicely with your product-led growth strategy. So for example, do you want to do a free trial or not? Is it forever free tier? Like, and then from a pricing perspective, is it consumption-based, which maybe lends itself to better for PLG, or it could be that there's tiers that you unlock as you work your way through the product. So being thoughtful about pricing and packaging, and actually, I think it's Jason Lemkin of SaaStr is like, if you're not playing with pricing every couple of quarters, you're doing it wrong. So always trying out new experiments here, I think is really important. And the other piece for the PMM or the marketer is like owning that funnel to at least that registration step when they get into the product. So thinking thoughtfully about, how does my message in a campaign yield to a landing page, yield to learning more about the product, yield to possibly signing up for the product to do an initial trial or initial usage of it. So in that PMM, again, depending on the size of your team, that PMM might have a demand gen counterpart who's they're working with on kind of top of funnel activity campaigns, as well as lifecycle marketing once people get into the product, to kind of push them toward those activation points as well. But I typically put two in a box, product leader and a product marketer together to kind of own this whole process. And they in turn work with, like if I'm a product marketer, I work with demand gen. If I'm a PMM, I work with my analytics team to give me the funnel analytics and like lifecycle insights, right? I work with my RevOps team to set up rules of engagement for like, when do we take a self-serve customer who's been with us for a bit and maybe escalate it to sales? Maybe they didn't sign up for anything after the trial, or maybe they've been using the product at a steady state for a while and there's an opportunity to expand their usage, right? And then ultimately, like, how does this interact with the sales and CSM teams as well? So they have this playbook in place for, how do I handle these product qualified users? Some people call these product qualified leads. Maybe they're not paying yet, they've just been using the product. These are like better than sales qualified leads because they're product qualified, right? They've already used the product. So how do we handle moving those leads over to a sales account executive, or maybe to a customer success manager who's got that account and is trying to encourage their more successful use of the product as well? So there's quite a few players involved, but at the core for me, it's always been like a product leader and a marketing leader, kind of two in the box, thinking about that self-serve motion, that self-serve business.
Yeah, I love how you set the table and the foundation there with especially that product owner and then the PMM, and kind of like, what are the sort of like foundational investments we need to make? I mean, you talked a lot about instrumentation and getting your analytics sort of dialed in, and super important, because that's the kind of thing that's, for better or worse, going to compound as you add these other roles and these other activities. And it's a great note on just like being thoughtful about like, what are these foundational things that we have to be there such that we can build the house on top of that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, also having that very transparent view of what's going on, kind of it allows you to do a lot of truth seeking in your organization. So having that data, that common dashboard visible to everybody in the organization, like there should be no secrets here either, right? I found a ton of wasted time between like marketing and sales in general and product. And a lot of it comes from not having a common shared view of the customer's behavior, the data, like what's going on there. So for me, it's like foundational. And if I made mistakes in the past, it's been that I haven't invested strongly enough in analytics and the team to support that. So I would urge people to like prioritize that for the business in general, but for PLG in particular. And then again, once you have the analytics, just a story from New Relic, we took where people were in stage in the product, and that became a custom tag we fed into a tool called Intercom to do programmatic outbound lifecycle marketing, right? And once we set up the campaign, we refined it and measured it and A/B tested it. But like, we got tremendous open rates on those emails. We got lots of engagement out of them because it was all very data driven. People weren't getting spam emails that were, I've already done that. Why are you telling me about that feature? I've already used it, right? The worst thing you can do, especially with you mentioned engineers as an audience before.
Oh yeah.
Let's talk about people who are hard to communicate with. No offense to engineers on the call, but like, very busy, very heads down, high bullshit filter. So if I'm going to send an email to somebody who's an engineer using my product, it demo better be valuable, right? And the way
Yep.
you do that is through data and insight and knowing where they are in the journey. And that for me is like the core of like a strong PLG practice.
Yeah, yeah. And the flip side of that is once you have engineers who are your super fans, they'll be some of your greatest evangelists. They'll wear your t-shirt all over Soma and, like
Yep,
they'll
exactly.
tell everyone about you if you do the things right. But yeah, no, really great advice. I mean, I especially love your advice and analogy around just like you're kind of flying without instruments if you don't have this data view set up and this sort of like insights and visibility. And it is such an important lesson, especially for PLG companies, because when you have the sort of traditional tops down thing happening, you're getting all this anecdotal sort of like one-to-one kind of like rich feedback, right? And that can be, you can get a long ways with that. And that can almost be, I hate to call it a crutch, but in a way, like you can get away with just sort of like, hey, prospects are telling us this because we're talking to every single one of them all the time. When you don't have that, and when you're trying to do this sort of like hyper efficient self-serve PLG thing, you don't have that kind of like rich, one-to-one feedback from folks. And you need to find ways to instrument, visibility into what's actually happening. Otherwise, like you said, you're kind of flying in the dark. I'd love to dive into next around just what these teams, what they are going to actually do, what needs to get done. I think the trap a lot of folks could fall into right now, kind of hearing what you laid out is like, oh, great. Like those are all, all roles that I've seen before that like people have heard of. Let's just go hire a bunch of those. Right. But I think there's maybe the big twist is sort of like, there's some different expectations and goals and sort of setting up of what that team is actually going to do, how they're going to get gold, stuff like that. So how would you kind of go into thinking about that for PLG?
Yeah, no, I agree. It's really important. It's, one thing to have really smart people. It's another thing to make sure everybody's aligned around like what you're trying to do too.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, so like with any business or project for me, like it always starts with what are the goals and like the key KPIs basically, which ultimately will lead you to understanding what a forecast could be for this, essentially this thrust of this line of business or your business. But like,
Mm-hmm.
what are you trying to do here? As we discussed earlier, are you trying to like fully sell people? Are you trying to just qualify them to a sales funnel? Are you just trying to get them to use your open source tool? Like, what are you trying to do? And
Mm-hmm.
then next click down, if you're trying to actually, drive revenue with this, what are your revenue goals? And maybe you don't know yet. Maybe you don't know what's possible from PLG motion. There's actually a decent amount of PLG benchmarking available on the web if you go searching. I don't have anything at my fingertips, but there's
Yeah.
enough like norms out there to start to think about, okay, if I can get 10,000 people to come in from either a campaign or visit my website, like what can I expect from my conversion rate potentially into registering and using my product? So building out like your framework for what you have from a goals and KPIs perspective. And then that next thing we talked about, which is what are those key value points in the product experience and the activation points by your persona, and being as crisp as you can on those. And often those are hypotheses that you then have to like watch and test again with your instrumentation, but having a real clear picture of that. And then if you understand those value points, again, what the pricing and packaging is with that approach and how it aligns to that value. And like implicit in that is, do you have a free trial? How long does it last? What happens at the end of it? Do you have a free tier? All that kind of stuff. And that's an area, again, I would encourage a lot of experimentation with, because, for example, I've had products in the past that because of the persona, they needed 30 days to do a trial because they were in an ops role where they got jerked off into other responsibilities and fire drills. So they didn't have the time to like devote a week to a free trial, right? It was more sporadic. So that persona we gave a longer trial to potentially, right? Or maybe you've got a product that has to ingest data and do ML work on it, and it takes 2 weeks to train the model or whatever. Like you need to be thoughtful about how long it takes for your product to deliver value or like the full experience, basically. So then, implicit in all that is you're thinking about those journeys by persona, right? So laying out the journeys by key persona, at least your hypotheses around those, which you'll then, refine and inform with analytical data as you measure the people moving through the experience. And then, making sure inside your organization, whether you've got 2 people on this or 20 people on this, like who owns those touch points? Like who owns the campaign level stuff? Who owns what happens on the website? Who owns the registration initial experience and that flow to getting them signed up for the product? Who owns the in-product experience? Who owns lifecycle marketing? Who owns in-product notifications? What do we do if we start to see them, signaling they're all going to churn, who's going to handle. So making sure there's like a lot of clear ownership across the team. And again, this might be one person if you're in a very small team, right? But typically, like I said, it's at least two in a box: a product leader and a product marketing or marketing leader. And then, again, using some norms you can get off the web or your own experience, set some conversion targets by stage in that journey and start to measure against those and see how you're doing and can you improve those and run, build basically a testing framework around that and some governance around that. So you can start to experiment with things that would improve conversion or activation. And I mentioned governance because more often than not, I've seen teams get in the state where they've got 5 experiments running at once and they weren't talking to each other. And all of a sudden, like our self-serve signups are down. Well, why is that? Oh, actually, there's a new campaign that launched and we were playing with something up there. So like having some governance across the team around when you're running tests, like who runs the tests, which ones won't impact each other's results, which ones will, and having a practice around that. Again, if you go to a B2C company, you'll see a lot of energy around governance, around testing. And that's important. It's an important discipline within any company, basically. So you're actually learning you're getting real lessons out of it versus false signal. And then, as we've discussed, you want to be able to engage with people either in the product or through email, with lifecycle type messaging. So you want to build out the tooling for that, whatever form that is. There's plenty of data-driven kind of communication tools out there. I've got a few favorites, but definitely stand that up as well. And then once you have that stuff all in place, you can start to think about what do my nurtures look like? What do my lifecycle programs look like? And again, I would not do a blind nurture. I would do a nurture that's informed by the data you're extracting from that user's journey, right? Because that's going to be much more impactful. And you're going to see, your emails will be paid attention to, basically, and you won't be viewed as annoying. And then not necessarily the last thing, but another big thing to think about is like, what's the escalation path to a sales team if you have one, right? What signals constitute them either a CSM or a sales motion, right? Like if somebody's looking like they're going to churn, do we get a human being involved in the CSM team? Or that on the sales team. And likewise, if they look like they're primed for like their usage says they could probably get a better price if they work directly with the company, or they could be sold an adjacent product, like how would a sales rep get involved in this process as well? And again, that's very much an experimental process as well to see what the right fit is. And it's often needs to be governed by persona as well. So I've rarely had account executives in the sales team like follow up with a user who self-identifies as an engineer to talk about escalation, expansion of the contract. It's often been another persona on the account I can see who looks like they might be the business decider, basically.
Oh, sure. And honestly, like a similar note to the great point you made around like outbound targeted messaging and lifecycle marketing and stuff like that. Same thing with, sort of sales and CS outreach. It's like, if you can have like come to the customer or the IT leader or CIO or whoever it is with like a really high fidelity of picture of, hey, here's actually how your organization's using our product right now. And, here's some things we can do to maybe tighten up security, pricing, governance, whatever that looks like. Such a better converting conversation than, the sort of traditional, like, let us introduce yourself to you. And they're going like, 25 people here are already using you. Like what's going on? You can kind of.
Yeah, that's, the rule of engagement there, like you said, is super important. Atlassian was like the beacon of light in this model, basically.
Yeah.
In terms of how you guys approached, it wasn't really it wasn't a sales call at all. It was a consultation to help them get more of the product, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. And, such a, better received conversation than what folks were used to in that arena, which was great to see. And yeah, I love all that. The whole sort of suite of advice there is outstanding. And I think the through line of it all, it's all super, holistic to the overall mission. It's data driven. It's powered by insights and experimentation the whole way. And, kind of aimed at kind of constantly sort of like tweaking the machine, seeing what's working, communicating, iterating, learning. It's all really cool to see. And it goes far beyond just, hey, we hired these people, do the same thing you did at your last company. Like kind of thinking holistically about what PLG, what this motion means, the different things it can do too. Great advice. Folks get pigeonholed on this is all about customer acquisition, but you talked a bit about kind of upsell potential and expansion. There's a ton of potential there. Sometimes the best potential for PLG is around expansion, actually, and having, product and growth leaders and the right other folks kind of lined up around that can unlock a lot. it's all really, really great advice for folks diving into this. So appreciate the detailed outline there.
Yeah, actually, as you were playing it back to me, I think the way I'd high level summarize it is like we all, if we're in a company together, we're typically all fanatically focused on the product experience, like making sure we build a great product and our customers really enjoying it. For me, a big part of PLG is having a parallel conversation with that user as they're exploring and discovering the product. Like that's really what it boils down to, is how can I help them? And I use the word conversation maybe in quotes because it could be an in-app message, it could be an email, it could be, just the way you lay out the features in the product. But how do you like help them along that journey essentially beyond just what's available in the product itself?
Yeah, yeah. I'd love to ask too about, because what I didn't list of roles that you would hire for is like a PLG manager or director of PLG or something, or a sort of single owner. Or I think a lot of companies get into this, like, who's the sort of like one throat to choke if things go wrong, or we need to do this thing, so we need to hire the person who's going to own it, oversee it, whatever that is. Like, do you think that can work? Do you think there's a path for that, where there's like I don't know, a PLG director, PLG manager, or someone who sort of like is the single owner of this?
So what I have done is had people in essentially PMM or growth roles when and collaborate with the product team. I will tell you, it's not as powerful as when it's two in a box. So
Okay.
this is probably not sharing too much dirty laundry, but early days in New Relic, when we were working on had the growth team working on this, we were kind of working adjacent to the product team, and we had some teams that were easier to work with and some teams that weren't as easy to work with. And there's like 6 different core products at New Relic at the time, and like again, we had great success in some areas and less so in others, depending on the dynamics working with the product leadership. So it would have been much better if we had, as an organization, said there's a product leader and there's a marketing leader together who own this whole motion and this whole business, right? And I think at the end of the day, it depends on the organizational philosophy. I've often seen the top line responsibility for this business roll up to the product manager or the product leader versus the marketer. But it really depends on how your organization's set up and like where accountability lies. But what I wouldn't do is assign it to a team. And again, I think tasking one person to do it will only work to the extent that functional leaders across those functions I described are all in and are metrics aligned to that person's success, right? So that means if you're doing, say, OKRs across your organization, if you do ask one person to take the lead on this, their demo better be an objective across the organization around PLG and key results that everybody's contributing to across functions to make that person successful, right?
Yeah.
So there needs to be an interlock across the functions.
Yeah. No, great advice. Well, I tell you what, let's jump to audience questions soon. Let me ask one more thing, because we touched on it a little bit, but I'd love to just go deeper for a second on this, and then we can jump to audience questions, which is, as you're looking to hire these roles, where do you look and what are the qualities you're looking for?
Yeah. So first, I don't typically care if they have a ton of industry experience in a specific industry. So for example, we, just top of mind for me, SignalFire is doing a lot of investing in digital health, for example. We're helping our companies look for marketers. My view is they don't have to have healthcare experience. They need to understand how to do great marketing or great PLG work in this case, right?
Yeah.
So as we talked about earlier, like I think an untapped opportunity is B2C, both product leaders and marketers, quite honestly, because it's how you drive that business in almost every case. So that's one place I've always looked. Obviously, I've always looked at people who come out of companies that have a strong PLG motion as well. Atlassian's a good example. Stripe's another good example. But the qualities I look for a blend of really analytically driven thinking, with a dash of creativity, of course, and above all else, a lot of curiosity and lots of examples in the background for how they were curious and went, typically these are people who are like, oh, there's this problem and I was really curious and I built some analytics around it. And then I saw the issue and then I did this and I did that. Like there are people who are probably hacking the system inside the organization they're in, that are curious. Those people I found do quite well as part of this team. And I think having data fluency is super critical. Like if you're not willing to commit to like being driven by a lot of what you're seeing in the data, then you're probably not the right fit for this kind of role either, whether it's on the product or the marketing side, quite honestly.
Yeah. No, all great advice. I especially love, I'll just underline the point about curiosity, especially with the speed at which you need to execute and iterate and generate experiments and learnings. Like you need to be creating a lot of hypotheses. Like, you like, yeah, you need the data fluency, you need to like measure results and stuff, but just like, you just need to be like a hypothesis machine at companies like this.
Yeah.
And that's where like the creativity and curiosity, like a SQL query isn't going to do that for you. Like you need to kind of have that knack for curiosity and creativity. And that's where you're going to kind of find the next thing to try and the next thing to try and the next thing to try. So that's a really, that's a really good point. All great qualities though, and really good advice for folks looking to build teams out there. So yeah, let's jump in, spend a couple minutes. If you're in the chat watching this live, you have a question, you can drop a question in there. And Steve is going to drop in some of our other questions. I'll read through these. We'll get through as many as we can. So Anna Anderson from Datasaur asks, how do you think about PLG for complex SaaS tools? Maybe you have insight on what a complex SaaS tool is. But
yeah, it kind of depends, right? Is it complex because, like we talked about earlier, is it complex because it's hard to like deploy and it requires tons of integrations to be useful? Like that might not be a great candidate for PLG, right? Okay, Anna's clarifying.
We've got AI, ML, model building. So we're getting deep tech stuff here.
Yeah, I mean, I've worked with a few companies on who are in this space, basically a little more details. Okay.
Yeah,
I don't know if I can do a live consultation on this right now, but we'll see. I think
we can dive in. We'll send you a bill afterward, Anna.
Yeah, I think in general, like, assuming the complexity you're talking about is it's a product that takes a while to get into and get value out of, right? I come back to like, is there a way to give value early on in the process or not? And if there's not, I'm not sure if it's the best, like using PLG, the early part of the customer journey may not be the right answer. It may be to do expansion over time, but it might not be to get them kind of initially up and running with the product, right?
Yeah.
They may need more assist. They may need like a sales engineer to help them, or a consultant who's technical to help them with that versus like guiding themselves, right?
Yeah. And you do see some interesting things depending on the product, but in this arena around like sandbox environment, open source versions, stuff that like, especially like engineers and technical folks can get their hands on. And especially with a lot of the exciting stuff coming up, like in the AI ML space right now, like you can easily see a lot of these things that, engineers are playing around with end up being 6-figure plus, enterprise contracts in very short order here. Right. Yep. So, but a lot of them now are sort of playing around for free or a couple bucks a month or something.
That's an awesome point, though, Blake. Giving people a lot of places to play, even if they're not deploying the actual product. Yeah. One of my last startups, we built a kind of a full demo environment out, and people would go. We had a couple of use cases they could navigate through the tooltips through it, and it wasn't their data, which of course would be even more valuable, but gave them sense for it. And we had about 4x conversion off that page compared to just people to the website. So it was a chance to give them a taste, right? Yeah. So is that PLG? I think so, because they're tasting the product and get more of a sense of it. But I agree, like sandbox approaches, open source approaches are a way to maybe not fully lean into PLG, but give people a chance to try it before they buy, basically, and build more consideration, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see what else we have here. This is from Teddy. What are some of the important shifts or handoffs of responsibilities for companies transitioning from sales-led to product-led? That's a great kind of topic for a lot of folks are kind of.
We could spend a whole AMA just on that.
Talk, yeah.
I think the first thing I would say is it really a transition, or is it adding PLG to your current sales-led motion too? Right. I haven't been in an environment where we've like walked away from sales-led tactics to only product-led growth tactics. Right. Usually we add PLG and it's an accelerant. Right. It allows us to capture a different class of customer. It's targeted potentially a different persona within our current ICP, or even maybe a new ICP. And then, we use that to build a parallel thread of business, or it reinforces our sales-led motion as well. So I'd be surprised if somebody went from a pure sales-led approach to a pure PLG and they like let go of their sales-led approach, but maybe that's being contemplated. I think a lot of the considerations we have talked about are really important. If you've had a sales-led approach and you're trying to layer in PLG, again, those, big sales teams call these ROE documents, rules of engagement. Like, what do you do with like a lead that's getting nurtured in a product-led growth process? And when does it become essentially qualified to have a human being talk to them, right? So setting clear rules around that, like on top of building out a good PLG team, period, if you're making that investment in PLG, and then building out some clear like rules of engagement between kind of the team running PLG and the team doing the kind of sales-led motion, and what the interactions are. Like, for example, providing analytics to every rep for every account in their territory for who the users are within the account or heavy users. So when they call the buyer, their main account contact, they can say, hey, it looks like, you've got your platform teams actually 4x their usage in the last quarter. Like, I'm glad you guys are really getting value out of the product. So it adds more credibility to that sales interaction. to bring those analytics and insights that are feeding PLG, but also can feed the sales process as well, right? So I would say I always think about it as additive to a sales-led process, and stand up the team as we've described, but also think about the interaction between both a sales-led and a product-led growth process, and have define rules. Don't let it be ad hoc. That's where you get into trouble, because what'll happen is your reps who are super aggressive may say, "Oh, look at this treasure trove of people using our product happily," and you could potentially piss off personas within your existing customer accounts if you all of a sudden sales starts diving into accounts that have been principally PLG led. So the rules of engagement, I think, are really important when you're going to stand up these side by side.
Yeah, that's great advice, and especially critical. We kind of talked about like ownership, leaders, and it does seem to really snap into place once you have like a couple of these different functions and motions sort of operating in parallel, and you want to set up, like you said, sort of like rules of engagement, kind of like operating rhythms with how they're going to be beneficial and not sort of bump up against each other.
And I think I may be painting the sales folks as maybe being the bad guys here, but that's not always true at all. I've seen PLG teams who are like, no, these are our customers. They can't, and you miss opportunities. So I think the main watchword would be a collaborative approach between your product-led strategy and your sales strategy, and being open to trying out different things. Again, being curious. If somebody's in the middle of loading up my product and they get stuck, can I throw a support rep on the line with them? But do I put chat within the product experience? Like, how do I bring humans and the product experience together for the best effect, right?
Yeah. No, great advice. Let's see if we can get through a few more here and what we have next. This is Alexandria from Laurel asked, what are the readiness benchmarks for building out PLG team? How do you know when it's the right time? Good question.
Yeah, I think we talked about this a little bit earlier. Some of it, can somebody sign up for your product and start using it without help, is like the first benchmark. I would say, is your product ready for PLG, basically? Similarly, have you built a user onboarding and registration flow that allows them to get into the product and use it effectively too, right? So is that ready? Do you have analytics? Do you have the data to understand what's going on? It's kind of, it's a little bit like that playbook, right? But let's make sure we're ready from a product and understanding perspective to start spinning this up. And if ready for PLG means we go from a contact sales button on our website to a register now or try it now, but it's again making sure product experience is ready, analytics are ready, the journeys are understood, or at least hypothesized, so you can start experimenting. And if again you're coming from, say, a founder sales perspective or a sales team perspective, like making sure everybody knows this is happening, making sure you coordinate well internally as well. So I think readiness is really it's a product and visibility question. And are you seeing customers getting up to speed quickly and your product getting value? Like that's, for me, that's the most important question to ask. Can they sign up for a product and get to value quickly? If the answer to that is no, then you're not ready for PLG.
That's a great, a great heuristic and a great sort of benchmark for folks to think about. Let's see if I think we have a few more here. Will from Doppler asked, how should we think about PLG for selling to larger enterprises that won't allow their developers to put down a credit card and start a free self-service trial?
You're assuming so much control they have over their individual employees.
I don't know if I've met an enterprise developer who wouldn't find
I'm sure from Atlassian you saw this happen in tons of enterprises where they banned the use of shadow infrastructure.
Oh yeah, yep.
I mean, Will, you know this too from New Relic. Like people do it all the time. So can they ban it? I don't know. Like this gets back to things like those sandboxes we talked about. Can you give them like tastes of the product? Another trick I've used is, a give and get approach where somebody can say, hey, I want to get into the product to use it. Even though I'm not allowed to put a credit card in, we'll say, okay, we'll give you a 30-day trial, but you need to commit to a conversation at the end of those 30 days, or we're going to do a discovery. It's going to become more of a sales-led process, basically. We're going to have an initial call with you to understand your needs. We're going to check in with you at 30 days so that, again, a good account manager can take that and use that to engage the buyer in the account and start to have a conversation about, the business relationship. So it's not, is it PLG at that point? Maybe not. What else? If truly they've got an environment where they're not allowed to put a credit card in and it's being enforced, I think the alternative is to get a proxy for that, which is a commitment to have a conversation with the company a couple of times. So you're getting more engagement than just a user with an email who's using your product, for months at a time. I'm personally not a huge fan of free tiers, by the way. I always like free trial to paid, with the ability for somebody to expand their free trial if they want to, again, interact with the company and ask for an extension. as opposed to like a free tier. I'm not saying that's not the right answer for some companies, but for me, I've always tried to stay away from it.
Yeah. No, good advice. And again, good framework to start to try to pin down that question, because that can be a tough one. I think we've got one more here. So let's dive into this one. For a company building the foundation for PLG, what are your favorite platforms for instrumentation? Great question. I know you talked about how critical kind of instrumentation and knowledge was. I don't know if you want to name names here or
well, here's the fun.
Think about,
Here's the fun part. I've done this in 2 startups and in 2 big companies, basically. And I will tell you, I've always prioritized having even in a startup, like a person working on data, right? Whose job it is to think about this, to build the instrumentation out. We used a variety of ways to collect data. Instrumenting products can be done in a variety of ways. Using JavaScript widgets, using embedded code, using logs. There's like a bunch of different ways to do that. And then obviously all that data needs to flow into some sort of data warehouse. We can do processing on it as well. I'm not going to endorse a data warehouse company by name or anything like that, and some of this has been homegrown internally as well. And then building out whatever dashboard you're going to use to understand that data and build your reporting and so forth. And then tying that into your CRM and or your outbound kind of comms channels. I did mention Intercom earlier. There's a bunch of other companies that do this. I think my point is it's critical to marry that data with your communication mechanisms with the customer, because you want to have that conversation into your CRM, so that when you have like a bunch of other people across the team coordinating, you've got one view of what the customer's been doing too. So I did pretty well at not mentioning names, but like those are the elements that I think are really important. And making sure you have like, it's implicit in like a tool like Intercom, making sure you have a feedback channel that you can have that conversation with the customer with. Like I'm a big fan of in-product chat for that reason, or at least in journey chat, to allow people to have some level of interaction that doesn't feel like they're committing to a sales call, but they're actually like able to get help and advice along the way.
Yeah. And speaking of sales pitch, I'd be behooved to at least mention Launch Notes. We're very committed to feedback functionality as well in our own product. So if you're also looking for to close the loop with feedback, check out launchnotes.com. That's my shameless plug for the day. But Jim, thanks so much for being here. This was a ton of fun, amazing advice. I know folks will get a ton of value out of this. So again, thanks for your time today.
My pleasure, Blake. You've been a great host. Thanks for the audience.
If folks want to, and thanks for the audience for being here. If folks want to connect, say hi, ask a follow-up, what's a way they can maybe try to reach out to you?
Jim@signalfire.com.
There you go. All right. Thanks again, Jim. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Blake. Cheers. Thanks, everybody.